Hey, it's Matthew Cudmore, and welcome to Story Behind the Stone. Today we're joined by Alexandra McKinnon, historian with the Canadian Department of Defense Casualty Identification Program. Join us as we talk about the ongoing search for Canada's missing war dead, the role of DNA in historical research, and the personal stories that echo across the generations. Alexandra, thanks for joining us on the show, and to our listeners, thanks for tuning in.
Welcome to Story Behind the Stone, where we talk service, sacrifice, and stories, connecting you to the past and the most interesting people in the field of veteran causes and commemoration. My name is Ryan Mullins, along with Matthew Cudmore. We are with Memory Anchor, a company committed to using technology for good as we change the way the world remembers. Today, we are with Alexandra McKinnon, a historian with the Canadian Casualty Identification Program. Welcome to the show, Alexandra.
Thank you so much for having me.
A lot to talk about, but how did you get started?
Really fortunate to be able to say that my job title is historian, which is a pretty special thing. And I'm fortunate in one sense in that I've always known what I wanted to do. I've always loved history. But at the same time, I couldn't have predicted the path that would bring me here. And part of that is that I sometimes say I grew up doing a tour of the Commonwealth. So I'm half Australian, half Canadian, and I grew up in Canada, in Australia, in India, and Sri Lanka. And as a historian, that interest in transnational histories is really embedded in my work. And as we'll discuss later, the Casualty Identification Program's work, it's not just a Canadian story in a lot of ways. But I came into military history specifically because I was really interested in understanding my own family history better, because I'd realized that it had been shaped by the First World War in a lot of ways. Each of my grandparents had multiple family members serve in the First World War. 3 out of the 4 of them lost an uncle. And these losses shaped the different parts of my family in different ways, but echoed across generations, including in part of the family coming to Canada in the first place. So on my dad's side, the story was well known. I mean, my great-grandmother was still around when I was a kid, and her favorite brother had been killed at Hill 62, so in June 1916 with the PPCLI. But on my mom's side, on the Australian side, there was really just knowledge that something had gone wrong, but the specific stories had been lost. And now in the 21st century, records are accessible in a way that they simply weren't for a long time. And so I could start to trace these stories. What that meant is I went on to study history and material culture at university. And like my colleague Renee Davis, who I believe has already been on the show, I wound up working at the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in Northern France as part of Veterans Affairs' Student Guide in France program. From there, I worked in education at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra while working on my MPhil thesis, which looked at the impact of conflict on bereaved families and their role in shaping cultural memory of the Great War. I finished up my MPhil thesis in 2020, and I was working in a museum in 2020. And as a result, as much as I loved history, when the world shut down, I didn't want to be naive about the prospects of a career in academia. And I realized I was really interested in different opportunities to engage with the impact of conflict and peace building. I found a lot of resonance in the work that I was doing on a conflict that had ended a century ago with the impact of much more recent conflicts. My parents are living in Sri Lanka, where they're dealing with the impact of 50 years of sectarian violence, including a 26-year civil war. And all of that is to say I actually wound up going to law school. So rather than a PhD in history, I have a JD. And a lot of that was about my interest in applying these lessons of the past towards the present. But life has a way of surprising you. And on my very last day of law school, I got offered a permanent full-time job as a historian. So it's a way to balance these different interests, but that range of experience winds up being helpful time and time again in this job.
You are now with the Department of Defense Casualty Identification Program. What does your day-to-day look like in that? What is the program trying to accomplish?
The ultimate purpose of the Casualty Identification Program is for the missing to be buried with their name by their unit and in the presence of their family. So the Casualty Identification Program is part of the Directorate of History and Heritage at the Department of National Defense. The Directorate of History and Heritage, or DHH as we all call it, it's mandated to preserve and communicate Canada's military history and to foster pride in our military heritage. So that it's everything from, if any CAF members are listening to this, it's the dress manual and the drill manual, it's music, managing I think it's 73 Canadian military museums across Canada. There are the official histories being published of Canadian service in conflicts and peacekeeping operations. And we, the Casualty Identification Program, that is to say, we're part of the heritage section. And the Casualty Identification Program works to identify the remains of the more than 27,000 war dead who died while serving with Canadian forces and who remain missing from the World Wars and Korea. The majority of these missing, so more than 19,000, lost their lives in the First World War. So we have what we refer to as remains cases. So when human remains are uncovered incidentally, they say basically anytime a farmer in northern France does anything, they tend to find things from the First World War. And so through farming or road work, sometimes human remains are found. And these are generally skeletal human remains, but we work to identify those. And the other type of case are what we refer to as a graves case. So when someone has already been buried as an unknown soldier in a cemetery maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and we receive a proposal from an external researcher that they believe, based on historical information, that we can identify them. When somebody's been laid to rest in a Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery, it's a little different to the American identification process because they cannot be exhumed. And as a result, our identification processes for graves cases and remains cases are quite different because graves cases are totally limited to historical research. This is where the public-facing side of things starts to come in a few different contexts, because for remains cases, when remains are recovered, we use both historical research and forensic anthropology to help develop this short list of candidates. Sometimes someone will be found with unit identifiers, such as a badge or with personal items that help us narrow a list of candidates. I mean, you really hope somebody's wearing a signet ring or something like that with their initials or has the remnants of an identification disc. But in many cases, you have that general historical research helping narrow down what units were in the area, where they would have been in relation to the recovery location, what information we have surrounding individual deaths. And once we start building that list, which can be quite long, we also look at what the remains themselves can tell us. So forensic anthropology helps us establish general anthropological information, such as their approximate age or height. And for a long time, if this were to give you a list of 50 or 5 or 2 candidates, this is where that story would end. That person would still have to be laid to rest as an unknown soldier. Today, however, we can also use DNA in the identification process. And this is what a large part of my day involves, tracking down family members who meet the criteria for DNA comparison and essentially calling them up and saying, "Excuse me, have you heard of the First World War? This is the Canadian government calling. Could you please give us some spit?"
How often do you get hung up on?
Surprisingly little, but I think that's
good.
because I don't start with the "this is the government calling, could we please have some spit?" We've I would say, polished the outreach a little bit more. And in relation to that, given we have no DNA on file from the World Wars, there are a few types of DNA that we can use if we have the right family member available to give us a sample. So one type, for example, is called YSTR DNA, which is passed through the Y chromosome, so from father to son. And then there's also MT DNA, like MT, not empty, or also called mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mothers to their children. So we're looking for family members who meet very specific criteria. A lot of my work involves finding family members for various reasons, either looking for a DNA donor, or in the event that we have a successful graves identification case, I'm also responsible for finding the next of kin in that instance, so finding the oldest living relative from the closest living generation.
It's not as simple as just getting a DNA sample. And of course, it sounds like you have to go through a large process before you get to the point of even going, we're at the place to do DNA.
For so many of these cases, sometimes the candidate list will just simply be insurmountable with the technology, with the information that we have available. Something like the First World War, a lot of records have been lost, particularly in terms of exact circumstances of death. Sometimes the determination made after historical investigation is just going to be simply, we can't start looking for DNA donors because the list of candidates is 1,000 people or something like that. There are two important parts of the candidate list. As I mentioned, there's the historical research, who's missing from that area, but there's also the forensic anthropology, so what the remains themselves can tell us. So approximate age, approximate height. We always hope that if we're looking at a case that that these remains will turn out to belong to somebody who's either old by the standards of the First World War, or young, or tall, or short. So, for example, with the recent identification of Lieutenant Francis Henry Hemsley, Lieutenant Hemsley was over 6 foot tall, and he was 37 years old, both of which are really helpful in terms of narrowing that candidate list. Another recent identification, Sergeant Richard Musgrave was 32 years old, and he was 5'3". So again, very helpful. Those are the kind of statistics you want, but the vast majority of the guys I'm looking for are about 5'5" and in their early 20s, which doesn't really narrow things down. But our starting point for any of this research, we're looking at an attestation file. So as part of the enlistment process, recruits provide basic biographical information, including name, date and place of birth, occupation, religious denomination, and information regarding their next of kin. All of these details have a part to play in tracing somebody's life and the lives of their families over the past century. But when we're starting with these files, sometimes this is easy. So you can match a name and birth date to an official birth record, or we can find a family and census records. And in 1,000 small ways, we can start to build out a soldier's family. There's some other sources that we can use in our work as we start to build out a family tree, everything from newspaper records to, as I said, census information, just really anything that we might be able to find. We normally use genealogy websites like Ancestry.com to start to build these trees and save sources. And if we're lucky, we may even find that another user is a close relative of the person that we're researching. That doesn't happen often, but it always makes my life a lot easier when you can just send somebody a message. If we are exceptionally lucky, a preliminary Google search will reveal that a local library has digitized an extensive family history, which happened once, or that a relative has posted about the candidate on social media for Remembrance Day, which happens more often than you might think. For DNA, we're not looking for the closest relative, we're looking for family members who meet specific criteria. And sometimes a viable DNA donor is not going to be the closest relative. But from here, once we've started that initial search, looking at the soldier and their immediate family, we can start to look for more recent records. And starting to build out a family tree, we can identify a living DNA donor who meets the requirements for the form of DNA that we're searching for. And that includes everything from obituaries to sometimes have to look somebody up on social media to see if you can figure out what province they might be living in. See if you can find a phone number, an email or something. I emailed a Halifax cover band recently, and they responded. Their bassist is a DNA donor. This all sounds really simple in retrospect, as I said, but not everyone has known and biological living relatives. Not all living relatives are viable DNA donors, and not all viable DNA donors want to be involved. So those are sort of three major challenges. If a soldier's adopted, for example, there's really not a lot to go on from that point. While attestation papers are a good starting point as well, we also can't assume that any of the information that the recruit has provided is reliable. People make themselves older or younger, they give themselves different birthplaces, and they change their names. Record keeping isn't consistent across provinces, let alone abroad, and there are quite a few people enlisting who were born overseas. And we sometimes don't even have the correct country to start with. Private John Peter Jensen of the 7th Battalion, for example, he puts down that he's born on the 9th of November, 1892 in Kerry, Ireland. From census records, however, he was actually born in November 1894 in New York City. His mom was born in Ireland, and his dad is Danish. And for that case alone, we were talking about 3 totally different sets of records, not including Canada. And another example, there's a man named Private William Crook. So both Private Jensen and Private Crook are missing from Hill 70. If these names are familiar to you, please register your details with us, because he gave his place of birth simply as Serbia. From his will, it seems as if his original surname may have been Motosiska, based on a reference to a man we believe may have been his father. But his next of kin was a friend who lived in Sudbury. And I've gone over every available street directory, census record across the period, and unable to find anybody connected to that friend's surname in Sudbury, let alone to the address that he'd provided. These guys on our candidate list, they're very human and clearly aren't thinking about posterity when they're filling out their attestation papers. I will also mention Canada is a massive, massive pain with vital statistics. So in Ontario, for example, birth records are not released until 104 years have passed. Well, it's 120 years in British Columbia. And so it means it's often very difficult to figure out if there may be any relatives living today. And we're working on gaining access to more recent records for our work, but at the moment we work with the hand we've been dealt. And weirdly, it's actually much easier when a soldier's family is in England or Wales. Those records are way easier to search. Irish records are incomplete. Multiple years of their census were destroyed. And so it's totally dependent on where that soldier's family was from, where that soldier themselves came from. We've been collecting DNA samples for the Canadian war dead missing from Korea. We have DNA samples for 14 out of the 16, which is excellent. But I think the holdout is going to be Private John Paul Keating, because he was adopted. This was an unofficial adoption in Toronto, which means there are no records associated with his adoption, but also his birth record is not going to be released until 2034. So I have that on my calendar.
You've done a lot of work recently. Is there any individuals that you've been working on? Did you want to share their story and who they are and how you got to that place where you could identify them?
I'll talk about Captain Wilson in just a moment, but I would like to, before that, just give a shout out to the Canadian Embassy over in Warsaw, because one of the guys that I'm still looking for DNA donor for served as George Sieko, but his name was Jegos or Tomas Sejko, which I may or may not be pronouncing properly. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, but he's among the missing from Hill 70. Born in the Russian Empire into a family that was half Polish and half Ukrainian Ruthenian. And so very complicated to try and trace, crossing a lot of national boundaries. He had 5 brothers. Our hope is that sort of at least one of them has living descendants who are viable DNA donors. But I mentioned Private Sejko as well because we're actually in touch with his granddaughter in Ukraine. So there's no viable DNA donors through that line, but it's clearly something that's still very impactful for the family. In fact, some of his descendants are fighting on the front lines in Ukraine at the moment. And we're also working on cases connected to everywhere from Japan to Denmark to the West Indies. And so what this means is that the work that we're doing, those connections that we're making, it's beyond Canada as well in a lot of ways. And so much of the work that we do, those connections that we're able to make, we owe a lot to local history organizations and other community organizations. For example, when I reached out to a local history society in Orkney in the far north of Scotland, the DNA donor that I was hoping to find actually owned the pub where the society had their meetings. So, I mean, really, we're one part of this work, but we couldn't do this alone. And I know, for example, when we have candidates with the Métis ancestry, the genealogists in the Métis Nation have been invaluable in helping us make these connections, particularly with somebody like Private James Robert Whitford, a Métis soldier whose father was married 3 times to women all named Mary, which in terms of finding a mitochondrial DNA donor, so through the maternal line, figuring out who was descended from which Mary was pretty crucial. And as well, there are organizations like Home Child Canada. So the 28th of September is British Home Child Day, and for a lot of the more than 100,000 sort of poor or orphaned British children who were sent to Canada as child migrants, tracing their lives is quite difficult, and we wouldn't be able to do this work without their assistance. Part of why I'm mentioning this is one of our recent identifications was a graves case. A man named William Webster Wilson. For the past century, an unknown captain of the 16th Battalion has been buried at Adinak British Cemetery on the Somme. You can tell there are a lot of Canadians buried there because it is Adinak, so Canada spelled backwards. As I mentioned briefly, and as I believe Renee went into more detail about during her podcast, with graves cases, we're not actively setting out to find them. We just don't have the resources. We rely on submissions from external researchers who say, this is the information we put together. We believe we know who this is. And in that case, the external researcher said, look, there's an unknown captain of the 16th Battalion, the Canadian Scottish, buried at Adinak British Cemetery. There are 3 missing captains from the 16th Battalion. Only one of them is missing from the Somme. The issue was it couldn't be that missing captain. The body was recovered from a totally different action to where that missing captain had died. The body was recovered alongside the remains of other men from the 16th Battalion who died sort of several weeks after that missing captain. And as we were preparing a report that said essentially, look, there are these unresolvable issues with this case, the co-op students assisting with looking at the case looked at the other missing captains on the Somme and discovered honorary captain and paymaster William Webster Wilson, who was officially part of the Pay Corps. He'd signed up in 1914, so pretty much as soon as the war broke out, he traveled over to Valcartier, Quebec to enlist because he worked for the Bank of Montreal. While he had extensive previous militia experience both in Scotland and in Canada, they said, look, we need you on the Pay Corps. So that's what he was doing for a good chunk of the war. But as the casualties on the Somme mounted, as things got worse, he completed a machine gun training course and he joined the 16th Battalion in the field. But at the time he was killed in action, the transfer from the Pay Corps hadn't been completed. As a result, he wasn't commemorated as a missing member of the 16th Battalion. Discovering that there was, in fact, this man that we hoped had last been seen in the location whose date of death matched that location. But his casualty card had been destroyed. Basically, anyone whose surname starts with S onwards, we don't have any information about the circumstances of their death. Those casualty cards are missing. But all this information started to add up. And the question became, can we find anything that will confirm 100% beyond the circumstantial evidence, like the militia experience, beyond the circumstantial evidence, like the machine gun training course? Is there anything that we can do that will confirm that he was in the field at the time he was killed, missing? This is where Australia came in, because Captain William Webster Wilson was born in Edinburgh, in Scotland, so born in 1890, and he had a brother named Hugh. And so after William and Hugh's mother died, William moved to Canada. He took a job at the Bank of Montreal. He wound up in Lindsay, Ontario. But his dad and brother moved to Gilgandra, New South Wales, so in the middle of country Australia. And at the point in time that William's reported missing, his brother from Australia writes to the Australian Red Cross Wounded and Missing Bureau and says, "Can you tell me anything about what's happened to him?" And the Australian Red Cross Wounded and Missing Bureau, even though he's not Australian, even though he doesn't die serving with Australian forces, they tracked down a Canadian soldier who says he was on patrol in no man's land with the 16th Battalion when he was shot. And the Australian Red Cross Wounded and Missing Bureau has digitized all those records, so we could find pretty much as close to a smoking gun as you can get that specifically says, this is Captain Wilson.
It's kind of serendipitous how a lot of these things seem to come together.
Absolutely. And with Captain Wilson, I mean, it's absolutely one of those cases in terms of tracking down family. So in this instance, we're not looking for a DNA donor. He's a Graves case. He's already been buried. He's been buried for the past century. But because it's a Graves case, we were asked to identify the next of kin so that the unit could formally notify them that their relative had been found. And as a result, my research took us from Scotland, where Captain Wilson was born, to Australia, where I found myself in the Facebook group for small country town in New South Wales saying, look, I know this sounds strange. I'm a historian from the Canadian government. If anyone knows Captain Wilson had a niece and nephew, if anyone happens to remember them, knows if they had any kids, if you could send me a message at my work email. And unfortunately, neither of them had any living descendants, but I heard from the nephew's in-laws who'd all grown up with very fond memories, and they'd inherited the medals, they'd inherited the memorial plaque, all of these things for Captain Wilson. They weren't the next of kin because they weren't related to him, but they'd grown up hearing stories about him. But that meant then I had to take one step further back and go back to Captain Wilson's attestation paper, because he'd sort of unusually actually listed two next of kin. He'd put his dad, and then when his dad died during the war, his brother in Australia, but he'd also put his aunt, like his maternal aunt in Scotland. And so I started tracing her descendants through a whole series of events. I wound up having to send an email to somebody's mergers and acquisitions firm saying, excuse me, I know this is going to sound strange. I'm hoping to speak with one of your staff members about this distant relative that they'd never heard of. Fortunately, they read through it. They got back to me, and the unit was able to officially notify that person's mom, who was the oldest living relative from the closest living generation, that this cousin of hers had been found. And for them, even though they hadn't known of him in life, there was a really interesting coincidence. Captain Wilson's mom's maiden name had been Webster. So her dad had been William Webster. And so Captain Wilson's family had a William Webster Wilson, and then the other side of the family, the descendant of this maternal aunt, they also had William Webster as a family name. So the third William Webster on that side was still living. And so even though they'd never heard of Captain Wilson before, it was a name that they knew. It was really special.
When there's an unknown graved individual, there's no exhuming, there's no taking DNA from that individual. So it's completely your research that has to identify that. Though when you see road work or building shopping centers or farmers and they unearth remains, those are the cases you get to take DNA from.
When remains are found, we can take DNA, we can do all of that. But yes, the moment somebody's buried in a Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery, even if technology changes, even if it may lead to an identification in the future, while we can maintain any DNA profiles that have been generated, we can't exhume somebody again. And it's one of the challenges with some of these Graves cases, because we'll always have to err on the side of caution. With Captain Wilson, if we hadn't been able to find the account of his death in no man's land, I'm not sure that we would have felt comfortable making that identification, just because there are too many what ifs. But it is really frustrating. There are certainly at least a few cases. There's an unknown captain of the 85th Battalion buried in Tynecott, for example. And there's only one missing captain from the 85th, and that seems very straightforward, except there's also a man who'd just been promoted, and it's not reflected in how he's commemorated, but he was badged as a captain in the same action and killed in the same action. And so I'd be willing to bet that it's one of them, but we just don't have enough information to say which one. And as a result, he's going to remain unknown.
Really shows just like how massive this conflict really was.
Absolutely. And it's one of the complications with something like, for example, we have a lot of cases connected to Hill 70. There's quite a lot of construction happening around the French town of Lens. As a result, pretty much anytime any of the construction's involved, a lot of the ordnance clearing that takes place in advance of construction, which again is a reminder of the scale of devastation of the First World War, because you have to have ordnance clearing before you can start building a hospital or whatever construction project they're working on. We're dealing with a lot of cases connected to Hill 70, but at the same time, there's 1,300 Canadians missing from there. The odds of any individual identification are quite limited.
Canadians know Vimy Ridge quite often, but they don't always know Hill 70, which was quite a battle. Did you want to maybe just give a little history?
The capture of Hill 70, it's part of the advance across the WWII plain that follows the capture of Vimy Ridge. So Vimy Ridge is much as I think some of the Canadian narratives seem to think, oh, we captured Vimy Ridge and then the war comes to an end. Vimy Ridge is one part of the story. Once the ridge is captured, the German forces retreat across the WWII plain to fortified positions, and that advance continues. Hill 70 is interesting for the Canadian Corps for a few reasons. It's the first time the Canadian Corps is fighting together, all 4 divisions, under the command of a Canadian officer. So it's under the command of General Arthur Currie. It was intended as a prelude to the capture of the French town of Lens, which was an important industrial area. From Vimy Ridge, you can see the pyramids, actually, from the coal mining. And the intention was that the Canadians would capture the French town of Lens. In order to do that, the Canadian commander, Arthur Currie, wanted to capture Hill 70, which is the high ground overlooking the town. And so the capture of Hill 70 takes place between the 15th and the 25th of August, 1917, so a few months after Vimy, part of that movement forwards. It's ultimately captured at the cost of 2,200 Canadian dead, including 1,300 Canadians who remain missing. But then the actual capture of Lens doesn't wind up taking place because the Canadians are moved up north for their involvement in something called the Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele. It's a significant Canadian action in the sense it's under the command of a Canadian commander. Hill 70 is captured, but at the same time, the capture of the town of Lens doesn't actually take place. And as a result, it's actually not one of the sites that had an official battlefield memorial placed there after the war. That's sometimes called the Forgotten Battle, but there wasn't an official Canadian memorial there until the Hill 70 Memorial Project a few years ago fundraised for the installation of a memorial there. Although that's still not an official Government of Canada memorial site.
Just while we're kind of geographically in the area, wanted to touch on how you're engaging in this really cool program with youth. I understand that you were over in France this summer.
Historians from DHH, we get to go over to France to train the incoming students working at the Canadian National Vimy Memorial and the Beaumont-Mel Newfoundland Memorial. So Veterans Affairs Canada has had kind of guide program in place for decades at this point. It's gone through a few different iterations, a few different formats. For the past 20 years or so, historians from the Directorate of History and Heritage have helped train the student guides there. Guides come over 3 times a year from Canada. They're there for a 4-month work term. They work in both French and English, situating visitors on site. At Vimy, they take visitors through the preserved section of tunnels that's open to the public and through the trenches, telling visitors the story of the capture of Vimy Ridge. And at Beaumont-Mel, at the Newfoundland Memorial, they take visitors through the trenches there and talk about the 1st of July, particularly for the Newfoundlanders. It's an amazing program. It's really cool. One of the things that Veterans Affairs doesn't hire for is pre-existing historical expertise. So they're looking for students who are willing to learn, but there's no expectation that they're coming into this with any knowledge of history whatsoever. And what this means is that when we come over as historians, we have about a week to go survey the different sites we want to take them to. Well, we have a few days, and then on weekends, we just go visit different battlefields. But then we have 4 days to essentially explain the entirety of the First World War to university students. My colleague Renee Davis and I were over there. It's the first time that both historians going over to train the guides have been former guides themselves. So it was great to be able to say, we've been in your shoes. We know how overwhelming this is. We know how probably sleep deprived or jet lagged you are, but this work is really important and we're so glad that we get to share it with you.
It sounds like you're getting so much out of it yourself. What are the students taking away from it?
One of the interesting things that we did was at the start, we just asked everyone what their connection to these sites were. And a lot of them spoke about Vimy, or they said that they didn't really think that they had a connection, that this was something they were interested in, but they didn't know if they had a family story. They didn't know anything about that. And part of it's understanding why we're talking about these sites now, why 110 years later, there's a student guide program, they're coming over to visit these places. And certainly that historical component is really important, teaching them the history of these places, going year by year and helping explain the First World War. But the other part of it is helping them develop their own connections to these spaces. But it's a chance to find your own connections to these stories, and not just the big narratives, but really sort of that individual experience and what it meant for the people actually serving at Vimy, people serving on the Somme. And so it meant we were really grateful we were able to spend a bit of time in cemeteries with them, a bit of time visiting some of the battlefields around these sites. So they're going to get to know Vimy and Beaumont really, really well for the next few months, but helping understand that this is one part of a much bigger story and that they're part of that story as well by having come to these sites and taking this role.
I love this full circle that you've created in your own experience from being a guide to training guides. As we start wrapping down here, just from the beginning, as you're talking about your three uncles and you doing that research yourself, can you tell me, have you been able to get to their graves overseas? And what was that experience like for you?
I visited some of the battlefields of the Western Front with my grandmother, whose uncle had been killed while serving with the PPCLI at Hill 62. What my sister and I refer to as the world's most depressing family vacation to Europe. But I remember having this image of a cemetery that went on forever. And I realized in retrospect that's because it was Leichenthal, where there are more than 10,000 war dead buried there. So he died of wounds received at Hill 62. But on my mom's side, one great uncle was killed on the 29th of September, 1918, so during the breaking of the Hindenburg Line. And I was able to visit that site with my mom when I was working at Vimy, so she stopped by for a few days and we drove down to the Somme, down to this tiny little cemetery in a village. And as far as we can tell, we're the first members of the family to have ever been there. And that was, really special, like a guy from Tasmania, so literally the opposite side of the world. The other great uncle of my mom's who'd been killed, he dies at Gallipoli. So he dies serving with Australian forces, dies during the landings at Gallipoli. And I helped take a group of Australian undergrads to visit the battlefields when I was doing my master's. And as far as we can tell, that trip to Gallipoli, where his name's on the Lone Pine Memorial, so he's among the missing. Again, it's the first time a member of my family had been there since the 25th of April, 1915, when he's killed during the landings. And being able to go there a little bit later with my mom and with my sister, I'm able to share that story was really, really special. But it's a strange feeling seeing names on a headstone. And it's one of the things that I think is so interesting about this work that we do, and why I'm so grateful that I get to work with members of the public, because these losses echo across generations in totally different ways. In the work that we've been doing, I've met families whose parents or grandparents refused to speak the war, and others where they were named for this lost loved one, and families where both of those things are true at once. I've spoken to a 91-year-old man in New Zealand about his uncle. I've listened to a recording of a soldier's brother who was the bandmaster at the Savoy Hotel in London at the height of the Roaring 20s. It's a really special connection, being able to help families find those connections, even if at the end of the day we're not able to make an identification. Every DNA test, every connection that we make, it puts us one step closer towards identifying these guys, whatever that outcome.
I think that summarizes the spirit of what you're doing is the word connection. You're connecting information to people and people to history and families to their own history and the memories of these individuals to the general public. And it's amazing work. It's important work. So on that note, if people want to connect to you, connect to some of these individuals, there's a call out for information, as you mentioned. Where do people go to learn more?
For anyone listening to this who has a missing family member who died with Canadian Forces, even if it's a distant connection, we would love to hear from you. So on the Casualty Identification Program's website, so if you Google Casualty Identification Program or Casualty Identification Program Canada, we have a form on there for family members to register their details. What this means is that if your loved one appears as a candidate in a case, we can use the registry to get in touch with you instead of my needing to track you down. Multiple DNA donors have been identified through this form, which is fantastic. Given those restrictions on vital statistics information in Canada, our best method of finding family members is often other family members. So even if you're not a viable DNA donor, you may be able to help us or provide us with information that will lead us to one. The other thing is that we are now doing monthly social media posts on the Canadian Armed Forces social media. So every month we're profiling a few candidates missing from cases. A lot of them are Hill 70, but not all of them. We would love to connect with the families of those men, but also just more generally, would love to hear from anyone.
Alexandra, we've so enjoyed chatting with you today to learn a little bit more about how you got started, how your day-to-day looks, your outreach and engagement with families. And I think we all know when we get a call from the government asking for a vial spit that it might actually be a legitimate question.
Anyone listening to this, please tell your friends so that they don't think we're a scam.
It's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you again for coming on and doing the work that you're doing for Canadians and their families. Thank you. Thanks so much for tuning in. Story Behind the Stone is available on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on the Wreaths Across America radio network, on iHeartRadio, Audacity, and TuneIn. Just search for Wreath. We air every Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern on the Wreaths Across Radio Network. Thank you for tuning in.